السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من برنامج من الداخل عبر قناة الميادين. معكم زينب الصفار. لعل المنطقة اليوم تمر في لحظة حرجة عقب اغتيال الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الفريق قاسم سليماني قائد قوة القدس في حرس الثورة الإسلامية الإيرانية، والقائد في الحشد الشعبي العراقي أبو مهدي المهندس ورفاقهما. بأي تعريف هي جريمة حرب صريحة وواضحة المعالم والتخطيط، هو انتهاك للسيادة العراقية والإيرانية في آن واحد وللقانون الدولي. هذا العمل الإجرامي وتبعاته يهددان بإشعال حرب كارثية واسعة النطاق تشمل العديد من الدول وتعرض ملايين الأرواح للخطر بحسب المراقبين. لم تنتهي استفزازات الرئيس ترامب بالاغتيال، صرح علانية بأن الولايات المتحدة ستستهدف 52 موقعا في إيران بما في ذلك المواقع ذات الأهمية الثقافية، وهذه جريمة حرب أخرى. ثم هدد العراق بعقوبات شديدة بعد أن طلب البرلمان العراقي ورئيس الوزراء خروج جميع القوات الأجنبية بما في ذلك القوات الأمريكية من بلادهم، وبالتالي باتوا قوات احتلال تجوز شرعا مقاومتهم بكل الوسائل المتاحة. قال ترامب أيضا إنه سيجبر العراق على دفع ثمن القواعد التي بنيت لدعم الاحتلال الأمريكي والتعويض عن الأضرار التي لحقت بسفارتها في بغداد والتكاليف المتعلقة بمحاربة داعش. هذا انتهاك صارخ للسيادة العراقية وصفعة في وجه الشعب العراقي. العين بالعين والسن بالسن والرد بالرد والبادي أظلم، مثل يقال، ولعل أيام السماح اليوم ولت مع الريح، وبات الرد الحتمي والثأر هما عنوان المرحلة المقبلة. للإضاءة أكثر على هذه التطورات وما يتعلق بها يطيب لنا أن نستقبل عبر خدمة سكايب من ولاية نيويورك الكاتبة والناشطة السياسية الأمريكية سارة فلاوندرز، القيادية في مركز العمل الدولي ومنسقة الحملة الدولية ضد العقوبات الأمريكية المفروضة sanctionskill.org. Sarah Flounders, welcome to من الداخل from the inside, ma'am.
Thank you. It's good to be here speaking.
It's a pure pleasure to have you, ma'am. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump's order to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani was the culmination of his campaign of maximum pressure against Iran. It is a declaration of war, or rather it is an act of war. Sarah, as a leading anti-war activist, how did you read such a U.S. flagrant attack against two sovereign nations by targeting two high-ranking military officials and their comrades?
This assassination is the most criminal act, and it is an act of war. War against the people of Iraq, war against the people of Iran, and an outrageous insult. And it has inflamed the entire region and the people of the U.S., who are absolutely opposed to continued U.S. wars. So I think this is the most dangerous moment, and it will drive the U.S. out of the region. That's the only solution. It's the only solution. And finally, people in the U.S. are beginning to understand that it is the U.S. actions and that there is no solution except to get out. And to allow the people of the region to decide their own destiny. The U.S. has been the dividing force in the region for decades.
Right. Now, to add pain to injury, President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo followed their aggression with a series of lies, which were repeated by much of the mainstream media and many politicians. What can you tell us about that, Sarah?
Well, of course, they want to attempt to justify an unjustifiable act. And the very fact that Iranian General Soleimani was really on a peace mission and was an official envoy of Iran, this makes it all the more criminal. Even the U.S. Congress is demanding today an explanation. Although so many of these forces have been completely also complicit in the decades of war and of sanctions and of threats and U.S. occupation of Iraq. And the threats against Iran. So I think it's an important time for the people in the U.S., the grassroots movement, to come out in force. There have been demonstrations across the U.S. There's more planned today, planned tomorrow, major demonstrations January 25th, other actions that are being planned in order to demand of the government that they stop the threats, that they stop the war, and that they get out. That's very much how I see it, that this has inflamed and given a new level of consciousness and determination throughout the region to drive the U.S. out. And it's mass movements always that the U.S. government fears. Corporate power fears organized consciousness of the people. And right now, this is at a real fever and intense pitch. I think there's a new level of anti-imperialist consciousness in the region, a new level of anger. And at the same time, the U.S. big weapons are less decisive in the world today, that new forms of resistance have developed that give the people's movement greater leverage than they've had at any time in the past. Now, that is an amazing, amazing development, that people's militias with drones have a weapon that is more powerful than the Patriot missiles. And it shows that there's a new day.
People's resistance movements, yes, of course. Now, Sarah, the millions of turnout, this mammoth wave of mourners at the funeral procession of General Soleimani has been extraordinary, as much in towns such as Ahwaz that, according to U.S. think tanks, had proclaimed this town or this state is hostile to Soleimani. As also across the entire country, the turnout was very big and massive. Similarly, huge marches have occurred across Iraq too. This unprecedented show of solidarity, what does it mean and what message does it send in the region and worldwide? And did Washington anticipate or calculate or do its arithmetic when it comes to such a reaction?
They should have known, and there are forces within the U.S. military and corporate establishment who want war. They make money from war even when they can't win the wars. That is the insanity of corporate and military power in the U.S. today. So there are forces driving for war, and at the same time did an action so reckless. But there should be a new level of confidence of people's movements, the ability of popular militias to literally walk into the green zone, that the security forces that the U.S. relies on to protect them in Iraq stood down, opened the door. That is quite an interesting development. It means all the forces in Iraq today hate the occupation. And that is a new departure. They are no longer willing to protect even the green zone and even the U.S. embassy in the green zone, which is a huge the base of operations,
yes.
the largest in the world, and the greatest level of security. And yet popular forces were able to get right in and burn the reception area. Now that's sending quite a message into the reception building of the U.S. embassy. The fact that they did this and did it strongly, came in with mattresses, stayed the night, cook pots, tents, and said, we're here, and we are delivering a message. Now, every U.S. contractor and soldier on any base in Iraq, I'm sure, registered that message. How secure are they? Right. And right away, the NATO forces took the message. They said, we're pulling out. The Canadians, the French, the Germans, the British were all part of this occupation.
The Danish, yes, true, very true.
Exactly.
Allow us, Sarah, to stop for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to talk about 2020. Is it this decade, this American decade, or American century as a whole? We will talk about this, but after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد، وأجدد الترحيب بالكاتبة والناشطة السياسية الأمريكية سارة فلاوندرز القيادية في مركز العمل الدولي ومنسقة الحملة الدولية ضد العقوبات الأمريكية المفروضة. Sarah, welcome back. Now, so events show that the U.S. domination faces a fundamental challenge in 2020. It's no longer a unipolar world. The bombastic declaration made 2 decades ago that this would be an American century. Now, in 2020, does it ring hollow in your perspective, Sarah?
Well, it certainly rings hollow. The arrogance of the U.S. government that they could dominate the world is being challenged by the people of the world and all over the world. And it's happening in very interesting and creative ways. And they're sending a message of new levels of cooperation. They're sending a message that the roads from Afghanistan through Iran, Iraq, Syria to Lebanon will be open, that people will begin to trade and exchange with each other, that the divisions, the artificial, horrendous divisions that U.S. strategy has created on ethnic and national and religious grounds, people are rejecting. At the same time, there are new levels of cooperation. I think it's a very significant message that the naval maneuvers in the Gulf of Oman of Russia and China and Iran
sent a clear message.
They said, it's certainly, they said, we are on a drill against pirates. Well, who's the biggest pirate, frankly, in the region? Who's looted the entire region? So they're sending, again, a polite message, such as the popular militias coming unarmed right into the U.S. Embassy. They're sending a message that the U.S. should heed, that we no longer are willing to accept this domination and these terrible, horrendous demands. Now, the response from the Trump administration is to say more sanctions, killing sanctions. We are going to create such hardships in the region. And I think people of the region are preparing through cooperation with each other to resist the sanctions, to resist the occupation, and to resist the war moves.
Allow me, we will talk about the subject of sanctions, but after I ask you that, you know, all progressive formations of the world cannot afford to remain silent while the actions of the U.S. appear to be undermining peace and security with complete, utter impunity. As a leading activist at the International Action Center, what actions have you planned or are planning against this act of international terrorism?
Well, there are demonstrations planned for today. I'm on my way there right now. I stopped to do this interview. There are demonstrations all over the country planned for tomorrow. And that's another important action. These are instantaneous now. There are large demonstrations planned for Saturday, January 25th, that are international in character. And we are hearing from groups around the world and across the U.S. And I think it will be a day of far more than 100 cities on that Friday and Saturday, January 24th and 25th, coming out to say, U.S., get out, no war on Iran.
Right.
So there is a lot of collective cooperation going on among forces that know that if they don't make their voice heard, then the drive toward war, larger war, happens without our say. and people are determined to speak out now.
Right. Bless you. Though this is the people coming to the street, taking to the street to voice their concerns and express their anger and wrath. But I need to know your opinion regarding the international community. We haven't heard any reaction vis-a-vis the assassination and the killing of General Soleimani. They only expressed the hopes for self-restraint and restraint and control and so on and so forth. Why, in your opinion? I mean, Sarah, in your country, if a military general is assassinated this way,
right,
what would be the reaction?
There would be, beyond outrage, there would be the worst forms of anger, especially such a highly respected and popular figure as General Soleimani was. I mean, this is a figure even understood in the U.S. of great respect. So a targeted assassination like this, every country in the world should be speaking out. And really, this is the time, I say, where if the people of the world don't demand it of their government, don't demand, and I mean, this is true for people in Canada and in Britain and throughout Europe, they have to demand of their governments. I do think it's important that the troops from these other countries are being withdrawn, but there should also be demands in the UN. And instead, the Iranian diplomats are being barred from even addressing the United Nations. Now, that is a further violation on the part of the U.S. in the very treaties it has signed to make the UN an open forum. So you see, there is a level of lawlessness that goes with this attack.
Now, Sarah, sanctions are imposed by the US of A and its junior partners against countries that resist their agendas. They are a weapon of economic war, rather economic terrorism, or even WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, a totally, utterly inhumane approach that violates the UN Charter and international law. The devastating impacts of US sanctions in certain countries like Occupy Palestine, for example, or on already impoverished countries such as Mali, Fiji, Nicaragua, and Laos, and others, are not even on the radar screen of human rights groups and are intentionally hidden. They do not generate even a line of news. Why?
Why? Because they don't generate news because the U.S. government and the corporate media who operates with them is silent on these crimes. They will publicize sanctions on Iran or Iraq as a public threat. And they know how terrible the sanctions on Iraq were. 13 years, more than 500,000 children died in the first 4 years of those sanctions. So it takes a terrible toll, but it's a silent killer against so many countries. 39 countries, at least a third of the population of the world is under U.S. sanctions. And the sanctions operate in a different way in every country. What we are explaining in an international campaign is sanctions turns dollars into bullets. They're a weapon. They're a weapon to deprive the most basic kinds of medicine, of making water potable, fertilizer, food, basic batteries, essential medical equipment. All of that is consciously denied.
Yes.
That's right. This really becomes, you could say, a form of germ warfare. I mean, really, when you deprive countries of medicine, of immunization, medications, and the ability of doctors to function.
Right. It is a weapon of mass destruction. That's very true.
Yes.
That's very true.
And there are, increasingly, there are a number of countries. This was addressed by the non-aligned movement. It was addressed by the G77 nations, who are all issuing statements. We feel it's a time for the people of the world from below to address this. We're planning international days against the use of sanctions. That's in March. mid-March, the 13th,
March
14th,
14th and 15th. True, that's very true.
And we're calling for actions around the world, and we do hope again that many countries will respond in meetings, in forums, that the sanctions against every one of these countries be denounced and be stopped. And new ways of providing these materials coming through. If the U.S. sanctions, then other countries have to stand up and find ways of not allowing this isolation to take place.
Right. My last question for you, Sarah, please. Is there any possibility that the U.S. could be sanctioned for its endless wars under the same provisions by which it has asserted the right to wreak havoc on other countries?
Sanctions are based on power, the power of the dollar. Mm-hmm. So every country in the world could call for sanctioning the U.S., but while U.S. capital reigns supreme, that won't happen. So is this acceptable to the world or not? Sanctions are always, it's not just a criticism of a country, it's not just a slap on the wrist, mm-hmm. It's actually pointing a gun at the civilian population who can least resist. If you go to the marketplace and you can't buy anything, that is a real weapon. So at this point, we're explaining, no, sanctions are a weapon of the powerful against the defenseless. And this is why we condemn and denounce the use of all these sanctions against a whole number of countries. And we also want to build an awareness, because sometimes people focus on the sanctions on one country, the years of blockade of Cuba or of Iran, and yet they may be unaware mm-hmm. of what on Iraq.
True.
They may be totally unaware of the impact of sanctions in Zimbabwe,
right,
or in Mali, or in Myanmar, or Laos. Mm-hmm. I mean, one country after the other is sanctioned. So by listing these countries, by showing graphically, by preparing material on the sanctionskill.org site, mm-hmm. we're trying to do an educational campaign and also reach out to these countries that are sanctioned to be in solidarity with the people there that are facing these hardships. And this is beginning to be understood.
Of course, and also through Al-Mayadeen TV, through الداخل, we also support you. We stand up with you, and we hope that people would answer your call from New York State. Sarah Flounders, American political writer, co-director of the International Action Center and coordinator of the International Campaign Against U.S.-imposed sanctions. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your comprehensive and thorough insights.
Thank you, and let's, in the strongest possible voice, for peace, for unity, for solidarity of all peoples.
Hopefully, you're very welcome. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا من كل فريق عمل برنامج من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.